Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the fear and greed indicator. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. The fear and greed index actually originates from this website right here. I will link it in the description below in case anyone wants to go check it out. But the general idea is that the market tends to go between extreme fear and extreme greed. And the market repeats these patterns over and over and over again. We talked a lot about this back in March when the fear and greed index hit 90. The reason why we talked about the 90 level as being an important level is because during quantitative tightening in the last cycle in 2019, it only barely went into the 90s before it then faded for a while. And you can see the same thing happened once again. Go back and watch those videos from March, and we talked about how every single time, well, at least not every single time, right? But last cycle, once 90 was hit, we then eventually went down, into the below 30. And you can see the same thing happen once again, right? The fear and greed index, in fact, at one point in August, went all the way down into the 10 to 20 range, which is something very similar that happened last cycle as well. So perhaps that will be an interesting level to watch, would be whenever the fear and greed index gets back into that 90 range. Now, of course, there are rallies where the fear and greed index stays in extreme greed for a lot longer. Now, back in 2019, we only stayed in extreme greed for a couple of days. In 2024, we only stayed in extreme greed for about 1 day, being above 90, right? If you just take it above 80 or 75, it was longer. But in terms of being above 90, we only stayed there 2 days in 2019 and 1 day in 2024. And this got pretty close to marking the actual top within about a week or so, which is a pretty good, it's pretty good, right? It's not perfect, but it did a pretty good job. And I do believe at the actual top, the fear and greed index was still in the 80s, right? It's not like it was low. I mean, on March 9th, it was at 84, still showing that extreme greed. But right now, the fear and greed index is currently at 80. So it still hasn't even made it to that 90 level yet. And I suppose the question, of course, is if it does make it to the 90 level, will it just be like what happened in 2019 and 2024? Or will it be like what happened in the halving year of 2020? Because at the end of the halving year in 2020, we actually stayed in extreme greed for a very long period of time. This is where it's going to get very, very interesting, right? Back in early 2024, it definitely made a lot more sense for it to be a very brief area, a very brief time when we were actually above 90, because it still seemed like we were potentially repeating the 2019 pattern, which we followed through, and we said like it's likely going to take about a 6 month period at the very least to break out. That's the same thing that happened this cycle, right? It took about 6 months to ultimately break out. And so now it's not as clear if we compare it to 2019 or we compare it to 2020. The favor, sort of the reasons to compare it to 2019 could still be that we're still in quantitative tightening, whereas in 2020 we were in quantitative easing. But the cyclical view of Bitcoin would say if you don't care about that stuff, then it would make more sense to compare it here. So while the top in March of 2024 was more likely going to follow what happened in 2019, I think it's a little less clear exactly which way it'll go this time. Um, One of the things I would watch for though is, in 2019, after the actual top, local top, right? Altcoins did not run after that, whereas in 2020 they did. So if you're curious if your altcoins will really start to run against Bitcoin, it might actually depend on how much time we spend in extreme greed, right? If it's just a day or two where we're above 90, then that might not be enough to really bring the masses back. But if we spend a couple of months in this range, like we did at the end of 2020, then that could be enough to bring the masses back. If you were to look at, say, a moving average, it might be a little more worthwhile. When you look at moving averages of the fear and greed index, it actually I think helps you figure out, is it a one, do you pay a lot of attention to a single data point, or do you look at the overall sentiment? And you can see that the 30-day moving average of the fear and greed index back in March topped out at around 80. The 30-day estimate of the fear and greed index right now is at 71. Remember, in March, when the fear and greed index 30-day SMA hit 80, it got pretty close to whatever the local top was going to be. In 2019, when it was like 75, the 30-day SMA. That was pretty close to whatever whatever 76, I guess. That was pretty close to whatever that local top was going to be. So perhaps that would be the level to watch. If the 30-day moving average goes all the way up to in the 90s itself, right, where instead of just a single data point, right, if it's just one or two data points, the 30-day SMA won't go into the 90s. But if you get multiple data points where the 30-day SMA is in the 90s, then it would favor, retail coming back. And that's kind of been the biggest question mark about this cycle, is that Bitcoin keeps going higher, but retail investors just really haven't cared. I'll do a video on this later, but if you look at the social risk is still relatively low, all things considered, right? It's still at only 0.309, meaning that it still looks right now more like 2019 than it does like 2020. However, once this started moving in 2020, I mean, it really started to move. So there's no guarantee that it won't turn into this, right? But for now, it is not that. It's trending in that direction, and it will likely continue to trend in that direction as long as Bitcoin continues to go to higher highs. If Bitcoin sort of stalls out for a few weeks and doesn't continue higher, then retail might lose some of that interest. So it's going to depend a lot, I think, on how long we stay at some of these higher fear and greed levels, right? I mean, if it's just a couple of days like 2019, then maybe not as much. If it ends up being a couple of months, then you very well could see retail come back. And one of the reasons that retail does come back normally is because Bitcoin starts making headlines, and then instead of buying Bitcoin, they buy alts. And that's one of the reasons why Bitcoin dominance normally goes down in post-halving years, is because retail comes back. And normally when retail comes back, they go buy alts. And Bitcoin will usually then stall out for a little bit once retail gets back. Not like permanently, but it's just because people start focusing on altcoins at that point rather than the king, right? Remember, there's 3 years where Bitcoin dominance normally goes up. The only year where it really durably goes down is the post-halving year, which will be next year. So between now and then, what happens next year will likely depend on how long we stay at some of these higher fear and greed index levels. Again, if it's just a one-off and we only get let's say we hit 90 at some point. I mean, speaking of 90, Bitcoin right now is at 89K, right? It's getting close to 90,000 in and of itself. So if Bitcoin were to break into the 90,000 range and start to approach 100, then it would seem likely that the fear and greed index would go up into the 90s itself. And then the question is do you get just a single data point up in the 90s, like one or two, kind of like 2024 and 2019, or do you get multiple data points up there like 2020? And I think a lot of that's going to come down to, again, does Bitcoin go high enough for retail to actually return? Or, does it not? Right? Do we get the big headline, the six-figure headline, or do we delay it? And I think that might be ultimately what it comes down to in terms of how long the fear and greed index continues to go up. But for now, you can see that the 2019 comparison we did with the fear and greed index played out almost perfectly, right? We said when it hits 90, it'll likely mark the top for the most part, and then you'll likely see it go back below 20. It ultimately did do that. And so now it's all the way back over here, back up around 80, right? And if you go back to November of 2020, around this time, it was also right around 80. So kind of interesting how, cyclically it's at that same level. And then if you compare it to 2019, the 2019 peak, it was also right around that same level during quantitative tightening. So I guess we'll find out, which is going to prevail here. Again, earlier this year, it made more sense to compare it to 2019. Now it's more of, it's not as clear, right? Because the monetary policy side would say, well, look at the 2019 top, and just figure out when it hits 90 again, that could mark a spot for a pullback. But the cyclical view, which has been prevailing quite well recently, would suggest something a little bit different. So we'll see what happens here going into the new year. We've talked a lot about, different outcomes for Bitcoin and how you manage your risk and whatnot. Remember, I don't use the Fear and Greed Index to trade. I use risk levels. We'll do a video on that as well at some point. But I do ultimately think it makes sense to have a plan, rather than sort of go in blind. One caveat to this stuff, and I'll just reiterate this, is that sometimes selling when the Fear and Greed Index hits 90 can work out really, really well. Like if you did it back in March, it worked out really, really well. If you did it back in 2019, it worked out really, really well. But if you sold the minute the Fear and Greed Index went to 90 in 2020, you would have sold at 15K and then it rallied 4x after that. So, trading based on only the Fear and Greed Index is probably not the best strategy. I think it makes more sense to use this as confluence, right? To figure out, all right, are we, at extreme greed? Are we getting multiple 90 prints and people are just absolutely euphoric? And you're seeing other indicators flash some worrying signals, then you're probably going to get a pullback. But if it just kind of slowly goes up and doesn't really bring retail back durably, then it could always continue to climb the wall of worry, a lot longer. But that's the Fear and Greed Index for you. We could also quickly look at maybe an exponential moving average. Right here is the 30-day EMA, and you can see that it topped out in March at around 30-day SMA of around 78. Currently, it's right around 69. So again, these things take time to play out, and we'll see. We'll see how high Bitcoin can go. I mean, again, the higher it goes for longer, the higher the Fear and Greed Index will go. If Bitcoin were to get a pullback at some point, then the Fear and Greed Index will then kind of fade for a little bit, kind of like it did over here in January 2024, and then go up again whenever Bitcoin's willing to make the next move. So that, I think, is what you should focus on right now as it relates to the Fear and Greed Index. Do you get those prints in the 90s or not? I know I'm watching it. We'll see if we get it. If we do get a print in the 90s, then I'll probably do an updated video. But right now, the Fear and Greed Index is still right around that 80 level, which, I mean, is a heated level. You can see actually in 2020 we went into the 80s for a little bit, and it didn't even make it to the 90s before getting about a 20% pullback or so. And I do think there will be likely a pullback before hitting six figures. Again, if you look at the QQQ, it launched in March of 1999, and then the QQQ then topped exactly 1 year later. So before getting a much, much larger pullback. But as it was going up, when it launched at 48, as it was going up, it got to 95 about a certain amount of time after it launched, and then it got a pullback all the way back down to 80, right? So it did get a substantial pullback. So there's a good chance that you will see a pullback like that at some point, and it could correspond to the Fear and Greed Index getting into some of those higher levels. So we'll see what happens there. For now, Bitcoin is still right around $89,000. And I know a lot of you guys have asked a lot of questions about, how high could it go before there's going to be a larger pullback and whatnot. But remember, this is why just sticking with the king often makes a lot of sense. Obviously, Bitcoin dominance could go higher. I don't really know. I thought 60% was a reasonable milestone 3 years ago. Still seems like a reasonable milestone, but until the end of the year or the second week of January at the latest, I think it makes sense to be open-minded that dominance could, in fact, still continue to go higher. And obviously, a lot of people have asked me about this chart, so I'll mention it because I know a lot of people keep asking me about it. The USDT dominance chart is something I talked a lot about back in March, and obviously, because I talked about it a lot back then, and it did end up marking a mid-cycle top, people are looking at it now and they're wondering, is that going to mark a local top? I don't know. I don't have as strong a conviction as strong of a conviction on it as I did back in March. I do think this trend line will eventually break. It has to, because if it doesn't, it will imply that USDT dominance will just eventually go to 100%. So it will likely break at some point. I guess the question is does it break now, or does it break a year from now or 2 years from now, right? When does it actually break? So that's where, you can see USDT dominance has hit this trend line once again, and that marked a pullback back in March of 2024, and it marked some other significant pullbacks as well. So I would certainly keep an eye on it as a potential kind of like, all right, well, if there is a pullback, then everyone's going to point to this as the reason. If this breaks down, I would then start looking at horizontal support levels for USDT dominance, right? So like 3.8%. Or down here, you got one way down here at 2.5. Probably not going to go that low anytime soon. But if this structure breaks, then I think that would be sort of the next level to look at, about that 3.85% level. But anyways, guys, thank you for tuning in. If you're not subscribed, make sure you subscribe. Check out the Fear and Greed Index at this website here. Again, I'll link it in the description below. And if you want access to Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, make sure you check that out. Sale is going on. You can, in fact, lock in the low rate. We got tons of charts on the website for all sorts of different cryptocurrencies, and you can even filter through by which altcoin you're most interested in. And I have been pretty anti-alts for the last 3 years, primarily because I thought Bitcoin dominance would be in an uptrend of 60%. I have lowered my guard on that now because dominance is at 60. Some level of diversification can be warranted. But with that said, as always, it would be irresponsible to completely fade Bitcoin dominance until the post-halving year, in my opinion, right? Again, 60% could be the top, but if it's not the top, there's still a couple more months where it could, in fact, continue to go higher. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.